All right. Can you hear me and see my screen all right?
Yep.
All right.
Your screen.
Well, it did its little exit thing. How's that?
Yep.
Great. Okay. And you can hear me?
Perfect.
All right. We'll kick it off then. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really glad to be here. I love talking to people about native plants and getting started with designing and using those plants in their own landscapes. My background is in forest ecology and landscape architecture, and I'm on the board for Michigan Wetlands Association. So it's a great group. I'm glad you're here. And you should have received by email some handouts, a packet you have all of my slides already, and 12 other handouts. And consider those tools for your native plant design toolbox. And it's a lot to cover in 50 minutes or so. So I wanted you to have references to use in the future. So I like to start with some basic definitions whenever I'm talking to a group. When I talk about using native plants, I mean indigenous plants that have evolved over thousands of years, and they're well adapted to the geology, the hydrology, the climate of a certain area. And that can be at different scales. You could consider nativity at a local scale, like a watershed or a county. Most commonly, it's considered at the state level. Is the plant native to your state or not? But you can also consider it at the country and continent levels. So you might hear the term non-native plant, non-indigenous, exotic, inventive. The terms weeds and ornamentals and invasives all get thrown in there. Non-native simply means something that was introduced into an environment in which it did not evolve. And that introduction can be accidentally on hikers' boots or deliberately in ornamental material. The term weed is a very loose term. I think it just means it's a plant that's not wanted where it's currently growing. So that doesn't really have a lot of sway or definition to it. It's a very loose term. Ornamental plants are grown for decorative purposes, for their aesthetic value. The one I really want you to know besides native is invasive. And that is a plant that is both non-native to a certain locale and to ecosystems in that locale, and it is capable of causing harm, whether that be environmental, economic, or human harm. And they tend to compete so successfully that they displace our native species and disrupt ecosystem processes. So how do you know what's native when you want to get started designing? How do you know what's a good plant to choose? Well, at the country level, the United States, you can use the US Department of Agriculture's plant database, and that will tell you, that's the lower left image. It'll show you for Canada and the lower 48. It'll indicate an N for native. You can also use the University of Michigan Herbarium's Michigan Flora Online, and that's at the state level. And that's in the upper right, and you'll see the designation NT for native, P forb, perennial forb, for something like wild geranium. So that's a place to look. And then if you're trying to help a friend in another state, kind of figure out what's native to other states, I like the Universal Floristic Quality Assessment website, and that's the third link that I've provided, and the lower right image kind of shows you what that looks like. And that has other useful information, like how indicative is the species of site quality and pre-European settlement conditions, and offers a coefficient of conservatism, 0 being not very indicative of pre-settlement conditions all the way up to 10, which is a really, you get plants in the with 10s, that's pretty special. I also like to always quickly review why it's so important that we use native species in our intentional landscapes and conserve them in our natural landscape ecosystems. There's so many benefits to native plants. When you're using them in your more controlled landscapes, they do not require fertilizers and many fewer pesticides. They require less water than lawns and traditional ornamental gardens. They help reduce air pollution by not having to mow as much, having less lawn and mowing less, and by naturally removing carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And so here's an easy, something positive you can do to help address climate change by using native plants. They also provide really important wildlife habitat through food and shelter. They help promote biodiversity and a term, natural heritage. And this is one that's really important to me and to teach people about. Every place shouldn't look the same, be the same, have the same species. The ecosystems up here in Michigan look very different than what you might find down in Florida. And those plants and those ecosystems are our local natural heritage, and we should be proud of that, and I think celebrate that in our landscapes. Using native plants also helps you save money through reduced maintenance costs. In the long run, native landscapes require much less management than traditional lawns and ornamental plantings. And you also get improved water quality and soil health through that really good, deep native plant root biomass, which helps increase stormwater infiltration and supports all kinds of microbial growth. And the turf grass, for comparison, is on the left side in the red circle there in that graphic. So, in the US, we love our lawns. Unfortunately, it's sort of this default, I think, when people don't really want to take the time to design or restore their landscapes after construction. And I'm not saying it's totally useless. It has advantages when in high traffic areas, recreational areas, but it is very, very, very overused. And lawn doesn't make much economic sense. It costs a lot to mow, maintain, fertilize, water, keep that going compared to different native plantings. It also doesn't make ecological sense. The short long grasses and the non-native ornamental plants provide very little wildlife habitat value. So I definitely encourage, if you haven't read them, books by Dr. Doug Tallamy really explain this concept well, Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope, a new approach to conservation that starts in your yard. So those really go into depth on these concepts. And in that last book, Dr. Tallamy argues that our landscape should move and change with time, that they should support wildlife and not be still, stagnant collections of statuesque plant specimens. So we really can and need to do better. So I encourage all of you to take a fresh look at your landscapes and think about where native plants could be used to benefit you, your local wildlife, and your community's larger ecosystem functions. So let's start planning. First, you have to select your site and think about some important site factors like light availability. Is it sunny or shady? What are your soils like? Are they well drained? Are they really wet? Do you have some sort of extreme pH you need to take into consideration? What's the existing vegetation? Do you have invasive species you need to try to control first? Do you have really nice native vegetation that you want to work around and complement with new plantings? You should think about existing structures like utilities and sidewalks, and think about utilities above and below ground. It's best to have herbaceous species and low growing shrubs under and near power lines. Same goes for underground utilities. You can have adverse effects from woody root growth. And then having to remove those species later is a big waste of time and money and good plant material that's better off planted outside of those utility rights of way. And then you also want to think critically about your area's intended use. What are you trying to do with your new native planting? Is it in a high traffic area? Will you be practicing sports or other activities? Is it going to be primarily a wildlife viewing area, outdoor dining, or maybe a trail system? So some other design considerations. Do you want it to look formal, or would you rather it have a more informal aesthetic? Is it going to be attractive to wildlife? And if so, what kind of wildlife? For example, if your desired species are butterflies and moths, you really want to focus on nectar species, but don't forget those larval host plants as well. And often those are woody species. Do you have a lot of deer? And do you have an existing fence that you could take advantage of and do your planting inside of? Or maybe you need to consider an exclusion fence if you know deer are likely to be an issue. Also think about extent. How big of a space are you working with? And that translates to diversity. The more room you have to work with, the more species diversity you can support. As a general rule, you want to plant enough of a certain native plant species to draw in so that the wildlife can recognize the species. So about a 3-foot diameter circle for each species, or several plants of a given species. And honestly, I think natives look better planted in groups, although some lend themselves well to be a specimen plant. And the more diverse you're planting, the more wildlife you're going to be able to support. Diversity certainly lends itself to resilience of your landscape. And it's less likely that a single pest or disease will wipe out your entire planting. You also need to think about what the mature height and size of the native plants you're considering are. What kind of texture do those plants have, foliage texture, and what sort of color or seasonal interest are you going for? So seasonal visual interest, seasonal support of wildlife. For pollinators, you want to have things blooming spring, summer, into as late into fall as you possibly can. For birds and mammals, you want plant species that have persistent fruit in the winter, and then at times to provide fuel during migratory periods and when they're raising their offspring. Carefully preparing your site and protecting that investment in plant materials, that's just super important. So think about your site preparation. How are you going to get that soil ready, that area ready for planting? You remove existing unwanted vegetation. You can do that with a rented sod cutter. Use a low toxicity, non-persistent herbicide like glyphosate. Anytime you're using herbicides, please follow the manufacturer's directions, wear the appropriate PPE. There are organic options like solarization, smother cropping, repeated cultivation or tilling. And then you want to remove excess thatch by mowing, raking. In some cases, you can do a prescribed burn and loosen the soil if it's compacted. But I'm offering the first kind of, after my slides, that first handout I provided is 10 steps to a successful wildflower planting, which does a great job on getting you ready to do site preparation. I'm going to mention testing your soils really briefly. I say if needed because I think it's less important when you're doing native plantings. Remember, they're well adapted to our local soil conditions. So you can test for different things, nutrient levels, soil pH, the texture, organic matter content. And that's really, why you test. Make sure you're not extra deficient in certain nutrients. Make sure that if you're applying fertilizer, you don't over apply, or lime or sulfur if you're trying to get to a certain pH. I honestly don't recommend doing that. Just pick species that are well adapted to your site conditions. And it helps you tailor species selections. So when to test for native gardens? I would say you only need to do this if you know you've had a really high level of previous site disturbance, if there's a visible lack of topsoil and you suspect low organic matter content, if you've had significant trouble growing vegetation in the past, that's a red flag. And if you have your heart set on growing native species that have specific pH preferences. And I would say if the results don't show the pH you need for something like acidophiles or isn't basic enough to support calciphiles, I would recommend, rather than trying to change it, pick species that are adapted to the site conditions you have. Soil testing historically has been done through Michigan State University Extension. I provided contact info there. I just learned that the Plant and Soil Nutrient Lab is closed currently. It's being revamped and hopefully will be back sometime this spring. In the meantime, I understand that the Saginaw Conservation District might have some soil testing capability. So if you're in my area, Midland, Michigan, or reach out to your local county extension office and see if you can get help soil testing if you need to. I'm also providing in the resource handouts, how do you figure out soil texture just by the ball and ribbon test. And there's a YouTube video there that you can use to check that out. But it's good to know, do I have really sandy soils? Is it really tough clay? Is it really mucky organic, or do I have kind of a nice loam that's somewhere in between? Then you have to decide, well, am I going to install native plants, potted material, or am I going to use a native seed mix and use that to do the planting? And so they both have their pros and cons. Using planted material, those are sold as plugs or in pots. You do get a more instant impact because you're starting with more mature material. You will get flowers sooner. You will get a more structured planting because you can physically locate different species where you want. So it does end up looking more formal, or can, depending on how you do your installation. And it is more expensive because people have spent time and effort getting those plants to mature. It is easier to maintain a planted area than a seeded area, because those new native plants are a little bit easier to ID. You can stick in tags, where they are, and barring like your dog or squirrel pulling up your stakes, which has happened, where things are coming up the next year. For doing a native seeding, you can hand broadcast or drill. It takes time for these plantings to mature. Think like 3 to 5 years before it really starts to look like something. It'll have a more natural look and be less formal in appearance, but it is less expensive to do that approach. It is trickier in seeded areas. You'll have more weeds, and those can be hard to ID. It can be difficult to ID the little native plant seedlings. And you have to make more decisions about, is this something I need to keep or get rid of? So just keep that in mind. I also wanted to run you through some basic landscape design principles. And this is to help you make your native gardens look intentional and cared for. So we called these, when I was going through landscape architecture school, cues to care. You can put a neat frame or border around your planting. You can use art. You can use habitat structures, educational signs, plant markers, all things to show, yes, I did this on purpose. A human is kind of keeping track of this landscape. This is intentional. You can also do that by applying some design principles like unity, which occurs through repetition and consistency. So you repeat like plants or other objects across the landscape. You can have consistency in character, such as the height of the plants, their general size, the texture of the foliage, the color of the flowers. You could have a theme to your garden art throughout the landscape. You can use, so you do want to use some variety or contrast to prevent the design from being monotonous. Simplicity, you can pick 2 or 3 colors and repeat them through your landscape design. Maybe just choose one type of hardscape material. Just remember, it doesn't have to be complicated to be beautiful, and you can always add on or increase the diversity of your planting later. And then balance or a sense of equality. You can do that through symmetrical, like equally spaced elements, or be a little less balanced and asymmetrical planting, but you still get unity through repetition of some elements. I wanted to share an example from my own store that is in Midland, Michigan. And here I picked a location right in the front of the store. So I want it to be a more formal planting. I decided to set up a 10-foot radius around a riprap covered area drain. So I'm dealing with about 314 square feet. I don't want it to be too tall because you can see there along the roadway, I have a public sidewalk going by. I want it to be organized but diverse, and I want to be able to demonstrate that native plantings can be beautiful to my customers. And I wanted to support pollinators spring through fall and provide year-round visual interest. And the site conditions. It is hot, it is dry, and it is sandy. Just the poor plants bake out there. So I've thought about the size of my planting, where it's going to be located, light and soil conditions. And then you want to select your plant materials, think about height and color, kind of consult nursery cultural guides, and think about, well, what kind of spacing do you want to start with? And just to show you an example, the 4th handout in your collection is how to do plant spacing calculations. So you know, how many do I have to buy to fill a space? If I were to plant my demo garden in the front of my store with plants 18 inches on center, I would take that multiplication factor, 0.444, multiply by the square feet, 314, I would need 140 plants to fill that space. If I lower that down to 12-inch on center spacing, the multiplication factor is 1 times 314 square feet. I would need 314 plants to fill that space. So here's the design that I started, at least the interior of the circle. And I chose sunny, drought-tolerant species given the open site conditions. Placed tallest plants in the middle. That's usually a good rule of thumb, or in the back if you're viewing just from one or a couple of sides, and shortest species along the edge. So I tried to keep things under 4 feet. The prairie dock, when they're flowering, might get a little bit higher, but I'm okay with that. And then I have symmetry in my layout with repetition in both species location and consistency through flower color and flower shape. So I have lots of yellows and purples in this design, lots of aster daisy type flowers, as well as tubular flowers. And then I've added in grasses and forbs to help provide contrast in foliage texture. So I have very fine June grass and little blue stem, lead plant and prairie phlox mixed with the large coarse leaves of prairie dock. And then here's the shorter kind of outer ring of species. And I'm covering my pollinator goal with spring blooms from things like wild strawberry, roundleaf ragwort, prairie phlox, early summer blooms with sand coreopsis, wild petunia, foxglove, beardtongue, and spiderwort. And then late summer to fall blooms from purple coneflower, woodland and western sunflower, northern blazing star, prairie dock, and prairie heartleaf aster. So I have at least 16 species out here in my 10-foot radius bed. I've snuck a couple more in, leftovers from some of my native plant sales. But so here's what it looked like when I started. For site preparation, I mowed. I waited 2 weeks to see what got growing back. I herbicided the regrowth with glyphosate. I did 2 rounds of herbicide, 2 to 3 weeks apart. And then I knew how there wasn't really lawn. It was just mowed weeds in the front. And so I knew the weed seed load was really heavy on this site, and I just did minimal soil disturbance. I didn't want to keep dragging up more weed seed. So here's what it looked like just planted with some plugs and 2-inch pots and a few quarts. Here it is in its second growing season. You can see the plants are already blooming. I observed bees and butterflies and moths, and even the goldfinches were jumping around the sunflowers, having a good time. And then here it is last summer, third growing season. It really filled in. I had more numerous flowers, really minimal weeding. I had to do some taming of the woodland sunflower. It was not being the best neighbor and crowding some things out. So I did a little hand pulling of that. But other than that, pretty low maintenance. So speaking of maintenance, I always like to stress that native plants are low maintenance, but not no maintenance. Really, it's more adaptive management, just like with lots of other ecosystems. And there is a plant identification learning curve. So you have to be willing to learn to recognize what you planted and what you didn't, and figure out if what you didn't needs to go. I do recommend for watering, definitely important during that critical establishment period. If it doesn't rain once a week, you might need to do some supplemental watering. Look for signs of wilting, especially in the months of July and August. And you always want to water your plants in to make sure the soil settles around the roots and that they're fully covered. I really like mulching to start with, using leaves or wood chips. It helps hold soil moisture and suppress weed growth, and it decomposes, and just the plants will fill in over time, especially if you pick out some good workhorse ground cover species that help cover the ground and do that moisture retention and weed suppression as they fill in. So things like, that's why I have wild strawberry out there. And you do want to weed and spot spray, keep an eye on it. When I was working in corporate landscapes with native plantings, we were monitoring and weeding as many as 6 times during the growing season. At my house, I'm lucky if I get 2 or 3 rounds of weeding in a year. And I've learned not to start too early. I don't get out there until Memorial Day weekend usually. Otherwise, if I get too ambitious, I start pulling things, and sometimes you pull the little native plants before you realize what you're tugging on. So be patient. The natives are a little slower, come up a little later in the spring. And just need to check and see if things have died, replace things if you need to. If you lost all of the species, that might be an indication that it just wasn't a good selection for your site, and you might need to try something else. And then mowing, burning, grazing, perhaps, depending on your site, is a great way to help stimulate growth and seed germination and imitate natural disturbances with which a lot of these native plants have evolved. So here are some great resources for kind of diving in and learning how to use native plants in your own yards. to help with plant characteristics, help you with identification and suitable species selection. Native plant producers nursery catalog. So I provided in your handouts wild type native plant nurseries cultural guide and Michigan wildflower farms guide to the plants that they offer by seed. Reference natural history books like Michigan trees. University websites are really helpful. And then for site preparation, again, like native seed supplier websites, ecological restoration books, invasive species control references are good to have on hand to help you. So handouts 5, 6, and 7 include the cultural guides plus a list of salt tolerant plants. If you know you're next to a sidewalk that's going to get salted, a parking lot, something like that. I just wanted to show briefly some like a gallery of photos of native plants because they really are breathtaking in their range of color and texture. And you know, remember that it's not just the wildflowers, our shrubs like maple leaf viburnum, our trees like tulip tree can be really beautiful. Ferns can lend a lot of texture to a planting like maidenhair fern. And don't forget about our grasses. The wild rye are great. You can use them as a cover crop for native seedings. They're cool season. They'll get growing early and help suppress weeds. I love the airy sprays that switchgrass has to offer, really fine texture. A lot of our native grasses are really important larval host species, especially to skippers. And they add height to a planting and more interesting texture, and as well as very pretty fall color. Little blue stem in mass is breathtaking in the fall. So I always get asked about deer resistant plants. And my very honest response is that it just depends on how hungry the deer are. So deer, you'll see increased browsing because their populations are up. We're shifting into more of their habitats, their hunting restrictions in suburban areas. And deer are creatures of habit and they will return to the same location. So if you are trying to do a native planting in a heavily browsed location, you just need to assume that the deer will be there and want to browse on your planting and take steps like fencing, exclusion fencing for the first couple of years. I definitely recommend doing that, fencing off your shrubs for the first growing season or two, get them big enough that and their roots really settled so that they can handle some of that browsing. And I found with plug planting, you know, deer will come through and browse and actually they tug and they'll pop them out. So you want to monitor your plantings. And if you haven't done an exclusion fence, make sure you're tucking those back in and get them watered. And if you're fast enough, your plant material survives. But they are attracted to fertilized and irrigated plants. So they do eat most native plants though. And my philosophy is, well, I'm planting native plants for wildlife. Sometimes they get eaten by the wildlife. Here are some examples. I did provide handout number 8 are deer resistant species per Michigan State University Extension. Take that with a grain of salt. In general, species that are hairy or have like black-eyed Susan or have a funny scent like common yarrow and grasses tend to be avoided, left alone. But then some of these other woody species are in that document, and I've seen all of them nibbled back to toothpicks. So they fence things off liberally the first growing season or two while you're getting them established. I also wanted to talk about selecting species for pollinator gardens. So you need to know, who are the pollinators? It's not just bees and butterflies. It's lots of other species as well. And they need food. They need nectar, pollen, fruit. They need leaves for their caterpillars. They need shelter and water, whether that's naturally occurring or human provided. And it's not just picking out wildflowers. You really need to make sure you have woody plants in your landscape because they're often the host plants. So the last handouts 9 through 13 that I've provided give you a sense of what plants are host plants for what species. And oftentimes those woody plants have early season timing, significant quantities of nectar or pollen. So things like elm, alder, willow, they're wind pollinated, but that's food for the early season pollinators. Species like redbud, cherries, tulip tree, and basswood are also good examples of pollinators supporting woody plants. I like showing this table because I think it's important to realize that woody species support nearly 5 times as many lepidopteran species, so butterflies and moths, than forbs do. And those larvae are the base of the food chain and a really important source of protein for nesting birds. So you want the caterpillars so that you have all your beautiful songbirds in your yard. And then this helps you prioritize. Well, if I have limited space, what gives me the most bang for my buck as far as lepidoptera and pollinator support? And certain species serve as foraging hubs. So they provide like 75% of the food for lepidoptera. So if you have limited room, plant an oak, plant a cherry, plant a willow. I wanted to share this Native Plant Finder website with you. It's a great resource. Dr. Talmy developed that with the Forest Service and National Wildlife Federation. And you can search for flowers, grasses, trees, and shrubs by zip code. So native plants, and then see what kind of, they get prioritized by the number of lepidopteran species they host. So this is an example from Midland, and it shows you the top 8. Notice goldenrod is on top, supporting 71 different lepidopteran species, strawberries, sunflowers, Joe Pye weed, boneset, violet, those types of species. And then here for, again, a Midland zip code, the top 8 woody species. So willow, oak, cherries and plums, birch, aspen, cottonwood, cranberry, blueberry, maples, and alder are the highest. You can also use this website to drill down on a plant genus to see what wildlife they support, what lepidopteran species. So this shows you all of some things that violet is a host plant for. And you can work the system backwards, and you can click on the pollinator and figure out, okay, what host plants do I need in my landscape? For example, in our area, if you want great spangled fritillary butterflies, you better have violet in your landscape for them to lay their eggs on and for their caterpillars to eat. And this is a database that's a work in progress. So it's good to consult multiple resources, trying to attract certain species, or you're trying to rear species. For example, great leopard moth or giant leopard moth. I reared some a couple summers ago. Cherries are missing here. It was a favorite food of theirs. And this is offering up black locust, which technically isn't native to Michigan. So always consult multiple resources. And as far as pollinator gardens go, other important things to consider, besides making sure you have food for the caterpillars and nectar for the flying adults, having good sun exposure and sunny, shady microhabitats is important. Protection from the wind, being pesticide free and how you manage the landscape or avoid as many pesticides as you can. Make sure you're offering water and dissolved salts through nectar, dew, tree sap, and creating puddling stations, which are just like low damp areas. And then leaving vegetative cover. Leave your leaves, in the fall and over winter, having standing dead plant material for these species to overwinter in. As far as bird friendly habitats go, I wanted to just discuss, you need to have the food. So having the native plants that offer the insects for the birds is really good. Seeds and cones, tubular flowers, having food available spring, summer, autumn, and through those tough winter months. Offering nesting locations and shelter to allow the birds to rest and preen. Having water in the landscape, and brush piles are great for sheltering them from the weather and having places for them to hide from predators. Again, sunny to shady microhabitats, and then having coarse woody debris, snags and dead limbs, things for them to perch on, hunt from, places for them to forage for different insects, and a place to nest for our cavity nesting species. So for example, if you want to see some of the cool northern finches in the winter, it really helps to have native conifers in your landscape because they really love cone seeds. It's good to have red or other tubular flowers to attract hummingbirds, things like wild columbine, butterfly weed, honestly, all the milkweeds, Michigan lily, cardinal flower, and great blue lobelia, bee balm, foxglove beard tongue, monkey flower, jewelweed, vervain, and our native honeysuckles. Species offering native fruits during the birds' breeding season. Things like service berries, cherries, choke cherry, native honeysuckles, rubus, so the raspberries and dewberries, and blackberries, blueberries, native red mulberry, spicebush, and elderberry. You will have cedar waxwings, eastern bluebirds, and American robins. If you have these things in your landscape, you can attract those species. Autumn fruits, so those help support fall migration, supplying energy, and help you fatten up your year-round birds that are gonna stay with you through the winter. Things like crab apples, native bittersweet, or native sumacs, viburnum, Virginia creeper, winterberry, or Michigan holly are all great things to support thrushes and waxwings and northern mockingbirds as examples. And then just having those nesting locations in general cover. Some really good species documented for that are hackberry, ash, honey locust, spicebush, poplars, willows, maples, black cherry, and conifers like eastern white pine, red and jack pine, white spruce, eastern red cedar, and northern white cedar. The vines like grapevine and Virginia creeper and moonseed all are good. Tall grasses are native prairie grasses for ground nesting species, and then snags and other woody debris for our cavity nesters like woodpeckers, titmice, chickadees, nuthatches, and bluebirds. So here's another native plant finder with a bird focus, also zip code powered, the Audubon native plant database that lets you search by zip code, and you can drill down on a native plant species to see what kind of birds it supports. And coarse woody debris is really important to keep in your landscape. And by that, I mean dead trees, standing dead trees, snags, or dead trees on the ground, dead limbs, trees with cavities. Those are all just really important habitat and can honestly host more species diversity sometimes than live trees. So places to nest, dead branches to perch and hunt from. The birds can find insects in the decaying wood, places for pollinators like beetle larvae, mason bees, to lay their eggs and complete their life cycle. And then I'm just going to skim through this quick so that we have time for questions, but basically our native plants are very tightly linked to our native wildlife and their life histories. And it always amazes me how the timing and the relationships between our wildlife and our native vegetation. We just need to respect that and learn more about it and get those linkages reestablished in our landscapes. So to conclude, I think it's time to redefine the perfect garden aesthetic. Native garden design redefines what is beautiful. Don't clean up, leave standing dead vegetation over the winter. Don't prune or remove dead branches or trees as long as it's safe to do so. Don't use insecticides in your landscapes. You know, I'm going to steal a line from Dr. Doug Tallamy. He has his 10-step program. If you have insect pest troubles, you just take 10 steps back from the wildflower or the tree that has insect problems, and magically they disappear. And I just want to share some sobering statistics to put this in perspective. Pollinators across the Midwest have decreased by 90% in the last 100 years. And North America has lost more than 1 in 4 birds in the last 50 years. So we really need to raise the bar when it comes to planting our native landscapes. And that is why I hold native plant sales at my nature store. It's to help you raise that bar and do talks like this, because I really hope that helps. Please come see me at the store. Come visit us for one of our native plant sales. I love helping people pick out native plants for their particular properties and goals. So there's my contact information. If you have questions, have any questions about the handouts I provided. And Brianna, I think.
Yeah, so thanks so very much, Martha. That was really informative, and I really liked your example that you brought in from your actually out front of your storefront. So we have one question that I see right now. It's any recommendations for deterring rabbits and groundhogs?
Yeah, let me think. So there are, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there are certain native plants that are less palatable to mammals, just with their chemical makeup. So maybe you plant those species along the edges. There are, so that takes a little research. I always look on Illinois Wildflowers website, and they have, for each plant, they have a faunal associations, and he usually gets into the nitty gritty of the chemistry of the plant, and rather mammals will not browse on them as much. And then there are organic spray on substances. I think they usually involve garlic and rotten egg smell and things like that. They work to a certain extent. They have to be reapplied every so often, especially after heavy rain, but it does the job without, being unnecessarily heavy chemicals in your yard all the time. I would also say just physical fence barriers. At my store, I carry these bunny barricades that are tightly woven fencing that you can link together or just use one around a plant. I put them up as urban and high speed of the road. As I'm along at my store, I had rabbits demolishing my prairie docks. And when the prairie dock only has 1 or 2 leaves to start with, it's pretty detrimental when you lose one. So I just used bunny barricade fencing to keep them away from those plants while they get their root systems established. And I would say, that helps with deer too. You just need a taller version of that for protecting your trees and shrubs.
Okay, we have another question. This is from Nicole. What woody species do you recommend to plant along fence lines densely for privacy?
A lot of people will go with evergreen options, since in Michigan we have to deal with the winter months. So things like northern white cedar, red cedar, eastern red cedar. You could do white pines, eastern hemlock, things like that. I like, if you have enough room, I like layering in like a lower shrub layer too. So those tend to be deciduous, but give you even more privacy during the growing season. So things like witch hazel. If it's in a wet area, spice bush can grow very densely. Sumac works well for that. Like, think of all the clonal shrub species that you've had to bushwhack through. That makes a good, and prickly ash, if you're trying to keep people from moving through too, not just visually.
Yes.
I like prickly ash for that.
Yeah, I was actually surprised that prickly ash is a native plant because of how weedy it tends to be. So that is a good point.
Yep. And rubus, I mean, they're low. The high bush blackberry, though, like rubus and dogwoods mixed together, makes a nice dense border planting.
So there's another question. Are there some wetland ranked species that do well in drier conditions?
Yes. So that's where the example that popped to mind was buttonbush. And same thing for like spice bush too. If you don't have to have wetland soils to grow those species. That's just where they compete best out in our natural ecosystems. But horticulturally, you can grow them in pretty average, not really dry, but kind of average soil conditions up next to a house or in a yard. And that's where I like to really look at the native plant nursery horticultural guides. So those two that I provided for you, those are showing a little bit more how flexible the plant can be. And they usually have part sun shade conditions, and then dry, average, and wet soil conditions. So I would just, try to match, figure out in your particular site, what do you have, and then search for those native plant species that have X's for those particular characteristics. But certainly many of our wetland plants are more adaptable than we might think, just based on where we see them in our natural ecosystems.
Okay, so also, let's see. I don't see any more questions, but you did have, you're going to have your native plant sales coming up. You said May and June?
They're the dates for this year.
Okay.
Yep.
And where do you guys get your native plants from? Is it wild type or?
Yeah, I interned for wild type like 20 years ago. It was a great experience. And yeah, that's where I source my plant material. So each plant sale is a little different based on what's available and how things grow when they germinate. So spring sale is usually pretty heavy on ferns and early blooming species. I try to bring in a lot of ground cover to help people get those workhorse species I mentioned established and going in their native plantings. And some of them like earlier blooming wildflowers, and then whatever trees and shrubs I can get. Usually that availability is better later in the growing season. They've had more time for things to establish. So a lot of times, if I can't get it for May, there's a chance I'll have it in the August plant sale. And then, asters and goldenrods, later flowering things. And then kind of those spring, summer flowering things are in the June sale. We hold that one. We time it to help celebrate National Pollinator Week and educate people about how to support pollinators with native plants.
Okay, very good. We have one more question if you are comfortable with that.
Oh, sure. Yep.
So here's an anonymous question, or from an anonymous person. Any sites that help with designing the garden? So any kind of websites that help
Yep,
design?
yep. Oh, I don't have it on me, but Wild Ones is a nonprofit group that's all about helping people use native plants in their landscapes, and they've been developing templates, like design templates for gardens for different major cities. I think they just released one that is Grand Rapids, maybe Grand Rapids, Michigan. So they had a couple of different options. And then I think the next closest was like Twin Cities or Minneapolis, Minnesota, something like that. So that's one place. Michigan, the Michigan chapter of Audubon had different consultants do different like bird friendly, pollinator friendly landscape designs. So the species are already kind of picked out and laid out as well. So those are two resources. Let me write myself a note, and I can grab those websites and maybe share them. We can share them afterwards with the attendees, but those are the two. So Wild Ones and Michigan Audubon are the two that come to mind. There are also, I happen to bring, let me show you other like plant design books with a native focus. So I like this one, Planting in a Post-Wild World. And I want to say that gives examples, but this talks about choosing those workhorse ground cover species so you don't have to mulch all the time, and setting up sustainable plant communities that benefit one another, and having like mid-height vegetation, and then the specimen plantings and things like that. So there's definitely, you know, books out there that help you with species selection, combination, and some resources for kind of pre-designed plans. I do a workshop through my store if you're local. I'll probably offer that a couple of times this year. I don't have dates set yet, but where I give this talk, and then we have time set aside to actually sit down and work on your own property. And if anybody, you know, wants to come into the store, let me know ahead of time. I will look at your site with you and kind of make plant recommendations. Trying to think. I mean, they're hard to come by around where I live, but in Southeast and Southwest Michigan, there's certainly a lot of environmental consulting companies and landscape architecture firms that really focus on doing residential all the way up to corporate native landscape design. So, you know, depending on your budget and how much you want to do yourself or not, hiring someone to help you might also be appropriate.
Okay, well, it's 8 o'clock, and I think those are all the questions that I see. So we really thank you so much, Martha.
Yeah.
It was a great presentation, and we hope to see you soon.
Sounds good. All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.